Should product planning be top down from the executive team or should it be bottoms up from the engineering team? Well, the answer is both. You need everybody's input and everybody's ideas, and the engineers should bring a lot of ideas. That's what we're always talking about here on the Product Driven channel. We've got a fantastic episode today for you. To survive and thrive, you must adopt a product-driven mindset. Welcome back to another episode of Product Driven. Today I'm with Dave Reinhold, who is a fractional CPO. We talk a lot about fractional CTOs, so we're going to have a fun conversation today. His company is called Venture CPO. If you need a fractional CPO, keep him in mind. But Dave, what does a fractional CPO even do? You're the only one I think I've ever talked to.
Yeah, first of all, Matt, great to be here. Thanks for having me on. And it's a question I get all the time. I think product management as a discipline, as a career, is often misunderstood. I've been in this role for almost 25 years at this point, and I think my mom is still convinced I'm really the IT help desk. Not that there's anything wrong with the IT help desk, but so a fractional CPO.
Me too. It's okay.
I like to say that I parachute into companies, usually early stage companies, and help them with the strategic planning side of product management. And that typically means putting together corporate objectives, putting together product strategies that'll help achieve those corporate objectives, and then ultimately producing a roadmap, which is really the game plan for everything going forward.
So I was just at one of our customers today here in Kansas City, and they're a great customer with us, and they want to expand. They want to hire more developers with full scale. But the key conversation, their biggest problem is they're like, we don't know what to build. We don't know what direction we're going to go. We're having strategic planning meetings literally today, around like, should we build this product? Should we build this product? Like all the different stakeholders, all the different sales teams are pulling us in all these different directions. We don't know. We're trying to figure out what to do. Like before we go hire developers, we have to figure out what to build. And to me, that is always the biggest problem with software development. And so I agree with them. Like, hey guys, you need to define the work. You need a roadmap. You got to work through at least some or most of the requirements, have a direction. You need a product team. Like product problems are super important. And the biggest problem that companies have is they build stuff and then they're not sure who to sell it to. And like, even with them, they're like, oh, we could build this or we could build this. And of course, my question is like, well, which one is easier to sell? Right? Like I'm thinking about this from like a product and a business perspective, which a lot of software developers and engineering teams don't necessarily think about. And this is a critical bridge, like this product piece that you're helping with. Do most people that you've helped with in smaller companies and maybe they were like entrepreneurs or small business, or like, I have an idea, but I don't know how to build software. I don't even know how to build a software business. And you're trying to help them figure out like even sort of the business side of this?
Yeah, often that's a part of what a product leader will help solve for, right? So it's really, what are we building? What problem are we solving? Why is it a problem worth solving, right? Why do we think we can build some tech that's differentiated? So, I think good product leaders are collaborating with the executive team, with the founders, and really trying to figure out, okay, what problem are we solving? And is it worth investing in solving this problem before any investment into the tech gets made? And again, it's more about doing that strategic thinking and planning and distilling that down into a workable game plan so that by the time the product managers and the designers and the engineers start executing against that game plan, a lot of the important questions have been thought through and answered.
So one of the statistics I saw one day that sort of haunts me and keeps me up at night, not really, but I quote it a lot anyways, is there was a study by Pendo that said 80% of all software features are either rarely or never used at all.
Scary.
Which is terrifying to me. But I'm sure you've also worked in a lot of organizations where the teams build stuff and then it never ships. It gets put on a shelf somewhere, or it gets half built and then they scrap it. Like, how often have you seen that, through, what you do, talking to all these companies?
Yeah. So again, my expertise has really been more with earlier stage companies. So, that impacts my decision in two ways. In some cases, when you're building from 0 to 1, you're building your MVP, your first product to get it to the market. there's usually good clarity around what we need to build. And so in some instances, that enables the product team and the engineers to stay really focused on building something that we know the market wants and just getting it to the market as quickly as possible. On the flip side, early stage companies tend to chase the revenue, as I like to say, right? And so a potential customer or an existing customer will come and say, hey, your tech is great, but I need this one feature for it to really be meaningful for me and for me to sign that
Yeah.
contract, right? And so what happens naturally, the roadmap gets blown up and all the resources shift towards executing towards that one feature. And then more often than not, by the time the feature gets delivered, the opportunity with that client has faded. And that is so frustrating, especially for the morale of the internal team who just, jump through hoops to get this to market. It's a challenge that startups face quite regularly. And so, part of what I try to preach to the founders and CEOs that I partner with is really focus and sticking to the priorities. It's hard to say no, especially to what is deemed significant revenue for an early stage company. But sometimes you have to say no and really keep your eye on the long-term prize.
Well, one of the things we talked about before we started recording, I thought was really important. You talk about this sort of top-down planning is really important. Now, granted, when you're in early stage of a company, like everything is sort of 0 to 1, sort of top down. Like there's not
Yep.
as much like existing stuff to maintain and deal with. But as you get a little further along, now you've got software that already exists. It needs care and feeding. It needs maintenance. There's technical debt. Like maybe there's like millions of dollars of existing revenue that already uses this thing, right? And then the thing you mentioned, I thought that really caught my attention was you talked about there's bottoms up and top down planning. So you've got to go to the dev team and you got to find out what they want to do or ideas that they have. And I'm curious to get more of your insight of how you have seen that and juggle those priorities.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, a critical role of a product leader is to be the conduit or the connective tissue between all the stakeholders for a product, internal and external. So, right. So, external, you're obviously talking about voice of customer, potential partners. Internal, you have marketing, sales, also the engineering team, the tech folks, right? And so, that's a very critical aspect of the role because what you're supposed to be doing is gathering inputs from all directions and then synthesizing that into a workable plan. A common mistake I see often for product leaders is that they're simply doing top-down planning, meaning they're taking priorities from the board, from the executive team, and running in that direction. And I understand that, right? But I'm a big advocate for layering on a bottoms-up approach because often I find that by engaging the engineering team or the QA team, the product team, right? You have these internal folks that are living and breathing this tech all day, every day, and they have ideas and they know where the skeletons are and which closet they're in. And they're going to want to raise their hand if given an opportunity to say, hey, I like this roadmap you're working on. These are interesting priorities, but we also need to carve out time to eliminate this tech debt before it gets very exacerbated. Or we should really be thinking about this feature because I'm tracking the product usage metrics and I'm seeing a lot of users are getting tripped up over here. So that bottoms up approach not only gives the internal folks a voice to advocate for what they think is important, it also I find it gets them really more bought into the roadmap once it gets published because they
Yeah,
felt like they contributed, right? There's nothing
they
worse
had more
than
ownership and voice.
exactly like a roadmap that gets formulated in a bubble and then you go to the dev team for execution. You're kind of jamming it down their throats like, hey, here's your marching orders. And oh, by the way, you had no voice in this. That is not a great approach. It has to be more collaborative. And that's the role of the product leader is to engage all these stakeholders in conversation.
Well, I think you're right. Like the head of product, the CTO, the other engineering leaders, and all the product team, like have to get together and play traffic cop of all of this, right?
Yep.
But of all the things you said, there's like three huge topics here I want to unpack.
Let's do it.
So the first one is you talk about it being top down. And earlier in my career, when I was much younger and I was not an entrepreneur, I hated sales driven development. I hated it when somebody's like, oh, we're going to do this thing and we promised to the customer, you've got like 2 weeks or 4 weeks to get this thing delivered.
Yep.
Hated that.
Yep.
But as an entrepreneur with a lot of experience, now I'm like, you know what? I like that a lot better than the engineering team deciding to build some shit that we don't know if anybody wants, right? Now, obviously, there's a balance of this.
Yep.
But as an entrepreneur, I'm like, hey, if I can build this thing and it's going to drive revenue, like that's how we grow the business. That's why we all have a job, right? So what are your thoughts on the sales driven development and how I guess my take on it?
Yeah. So look, I mean, one thing to comment on initially, this is going to sound harsh, but the engineer should really not be making decisions on priorities for what to build in a vacuum. They can have a voice, as I mentioned earlier, but the role of product is to really produce a prioritized plan that makes sense for the business, right? And so if in that model that you're talking about, it's almost like there's no product function. So the entrepreneur is relying on the dev team to just figure out what to build. Now you might have some unicorn engineers that are particularly skilled in talking with customers. They're usually not, which is why product exists. But you might get lucky and they might make some good decisions. But product is really there to ensure that there's a good game plan. So just wanted to comment on that. The sales focused enhancements, it's a balancing act. Like I mentioned,
it's tough. It's tough, right?
Chasing the revenue most of the time, in my experience, does not achieve the outcome that you thought it would.
It could go the wrong directions.
It can go the wrong direction. There's always an opportunity cost, right? And so if I'm reallocating product and dev resources to build this feature for this specific client or potential client, there's something being...
An 80% chance they won't use.
Right, exactly. So, one thing that I recommend to my clients in situations like this is to try and get some level of commitment from the requesting customer, whether it's a letter of intent, which honestly doesn't really have any legal merit. It's not like they're committing to anything, but often I find the formality of getting a client or potential client that's asking you to blow up your roadmap on their behalf, getting them to sign a document that says, hey, this is what you're going to build. This is our intention after it's built, even though it's not legally binding. I think it formalizes the relationship a bit. And sometimes just asking that client to sign an LOI is enough for them to be like, you know what, I'm not really sure I need this thing. So there has to be a balance. Now, another thing I would say, depending on the size of your dev team, I've seen some approaches where you carve out maybe like 20 to 25% of your dev resources to be kind of more agile and really just, reacting to the current needs of the business, which could include new customer requests. And then you keep the majority of your dev resources focused on building towards the North Star, right?
Well, I think, and I think to be clear, when I say earlier, I prefer it because mostly I don't want to build stuff that I don't know that people want. Right. It's great to see the demand, but I think it's really critical, that I also clarify here that by no means do I want the sales team making stupid promises and then killing the development team to uphold them. Like, I definitely don't agree with that kind of chaos. But what I do like is that we're thinking about it from a product perspective of, okay, this is what the product wants. The market is telling us they want this. We have demand, and then before it is driving the roadmap. Now, hopefully it's not 2 weeks to deliver. Maybe it's 4 weeks or 6 weeks or a couple months or whatever. And it's reasonable. It's reasonable, right? And I love your point about slicing off some of our capacity to maybe do some of this work and be reactive. But I want to go back to what you're talking about earlier. So as an entrepreneur, somebody who has the product vision, like maybe from the early days, like I have a friend here locally I'm working with that is an expert in the dental industry. She doesn't know anything about building software.
Right.
What's really great when you have a really good engineering team is she can go to them and be like, I don't actually know anything about building software, but I know like this is the problems I'm trying to solve. You guys tell me, like, how could we use technology to do this like 10 times better than I even understand? Right? Like, in those scenarios, like you're way better off if you ask the engineering team, or you have somebody like yourself who's working in the middle. You're like, oh, okay, I understand how to build products. I can bridge the gap here. But my point is, like, a lot of times the engineers could help. Like, if you would just go to the engineers, like, hey, how can I build like cool software that could do this thing? Like,
Yep.
what would I do? Like, would I have a search screen? Would I do this? Like, how would we do this? Like, they could probably help.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. I think product is kind of that bridge between the business, right? The entrepreneur in your example and the dev team in the traditional sense. So having, whether it's a fractional CPO or some sort of internal product person to help facilitate those conversations, I think is important. But 100%, getting input from your engineers is critical, right? These are folks that are experts in building tech in general. Often they're experts in a specific vertical, and then even within that, like whether it's SaaS or consumer, whatever it is, right? They have great input that says, "Hey, I might not know exactly how to state the specific problem you're solving, but I can tell you that for a platform business, you need an API, you need X, Y, and Z, right? And those are great inputs. So,
We
that
can have more revenue, by the way, if we built this API,
right,
probably,
exactly. Because it can
right?
enable you to connect with third
Yeah.
parties that might not want to log into your self-serve platform because they have their own workflow tools that they'd rather tap into. So this gets back to what we were talking about earlier with this bottoms-up approach, right? You
Yeah.
have to give the engineers the opportunity to have a voice, right? And you think about like Agile Scrum in its truest form, one of the key opportunities for the engineers to have their voice is when there's a grooming session, for example, right? So the product team puts a bunch of tickets in the backlog, they put some user stories in there, and then they huddle up with the engineers and they're like, okay, let's make sure we have a common understanding of what we're asking for here. And then the engineers say, okay, here's how we're interpreting it, here's how we're going to build it. That's one example, but that, in my opinion, is not nearly enough because if it's at that point, it's already late in the process, right? So I'm talking even further upstream, whether it's like a formal, meeting to solicit the feedback or just leveraging relationships and having informal conversations. You really have to engage not only engineers but all the internal stakeholders. Have a voice in what you're building.
Well, here on Product Driven, one of the things I'm really focused on is spreading this message of we want the engineers to be more involved in product. We want them to be thinking about the users, having empathy of them, understanding the industry, understanding the problems we're trying to solve, asking why, like understanding all that, because they can potentially bring these sort of ideas and solutions as well. And probably a great example of that right now is AI. Like, the rest of the business, the entrepreneur, the founders, like whoever, there may not be very high tech, but like one of the engineers could be like, you know what, we could use AI and do this super cool thing over here nobody's even talked about or thought about. Like, could
Yeah.
that be a game changer to our product? Like, because I understand the product, I understand our users, I understand how they use it. Like, wow,
Yep.
this could be really cool. Like, I should go surface this with the rest of the team and the executives and suggest like we could do this really cool AI thing. And oh, by the way, I did it over this weekend and here's a prototype, like potentially, right?
Yeah.
Like that's how an engineer goes from like just being an engineer to being like a product engineer or, at a much higher level. Like, and to your point earlier about it's like the bottoms up, but everybody can be a stakeholder. Everybody can have a voice. Like everybody can contribute when it comes to this innovation. I think you joked before we were recording that like we don't want developers that are just code monkeys. Like that's not what we want. We don't want just coders. We want people that want to help build a better product. And everybody has a voice and everybody can help contribute to do that.
Yep. And I find that the best engineers don't want to be just coders either. There are some that just want to be sitting there, heads down, focused on writing code. But the ones that contribute the most value to an organization want to lift their heads up and say, "Hey, I have an idea. I have an idea on how we can optimize something, how we could do something better. I have an idea for a totally new product that's tangential to what we're building, but I'm
Yeah.
seeing demand for." So the best product leaders will foster a culture that facilitates that and encourages that. And most importantly, if folks are going to have the courage to raise their hand and speak up, they have to be heard, right? There has to be
Yep.
input has to make
You
its
can't
way.
shut them down every time.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, it's always a balance, right? And like ultimately you want to try and give ownership to members of your team. That was one of the things I talked to one of our clients today about. He's some of these exact problems, had these same conversations. And it's like, hey, I have to give my team ownership and tell them like, hey, you go figure out how this needs to be done. You know, you take the lead, you take ownership. And, you know, ultimately that'll help, you know, them make better decisions and smarter decisions. And if they get stuck on a project, that's like, maybe they don't get stuck because like, oh, I understand more of the big picture. I've been in all these conversations. But
Yep.
I think you nailed the big key here is it starts from the leadership. The leadership has to see value in this
Hmm.
and say, look, I want the developers more involved. I want to have more demo days. I want to have more meetings where multiple departments are talking to each other and you know all these kinds of things, right? It all starts from a leadership perspective that's leading the way that understands the importance of this.
Yep, absolutely. You know, there back in the day, folks used to say that a product manager is like a mini CEO of the product or business. I personally think that's an outdated view. I think nowadays the product manager is like, you know, whether you want to say quarterback or great facilitator, but it's this collaborative, connective role when it's done correctly, right? And that the best product folks are living that and breathing that and creating an environment where everyone feels like they can, you know, speak up because ultimately that's how the best products get built, right?
You want the best ideas. We need more ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, so we talk about the bottoms up approach. How do you deal with this though when you do have engineers that keep asking for to spend all their time on maintenance or technical debt or something that's going to look good on their resume or like we've all worked with these people. Like one of my developers before, like every time I talk to him, he's like, "We need to get Kafka. We need to get Kafka," and I'm like, "What we have works fine. We don't need to spend like $1 million a year on Kafka. Like
Right.
somehow we're okay." Every
Yeah.
time you talk Kafka, like how do you deal with that part of it?
Yeah, it's
Like
tricky.
as the product guy that's in the middle trying to do this.
It's tricky. And, you know, again, you want to give those folks an opportunity to speak up, but at the
You want
same
their
time,
ideas.
we're in a business, right? We're running a business. We're a
Yeah.
for-profit business. We can't let folks run with a pet project just to keep them happy. So, you know, a couple of tools that I've tried to use. If someone, for example, is asking to, you know, switch over to a new and emerging technology that all their friends at other companies are using because it's
It's
new and
gonna be
sexy,
cool.
I often will say, okay, let's put together, you know, a case study or a business case to justify why we would do this, right? Like, what do we currently have? What are the issues with it? What is the new technology? How does it resolve those issues? What is the cost? What is the implementation timeline? And that's not an attempt to just kind of shut the person up. It's an attempt to really make them think it through. And often what I find is if like, all right, I'm now being asked to put together this analysis, and first of all, it's not easy to do. Even with ChatGPT, you actually have to put some thought into it and really think it through. But often, I think folks kind of naturally get to a point where they're like, you know what, our current queuing system is a B plus, and it's sufficient. So Kafka, you know, for the $300,000 and yada, it's probably not worth it. And so they'll kind of naturally get to a place where like, okay, maybe this is not the thing I should be advocating for. But again, I think there's, you know, the tool there is to say like, hey, new ideas for that. There should be some sort of formal analysis done and kind of give them a chance to pitch it. Um,
Yeah.
Another thing that I've tried, and this has worked quite well, is within every sprint, carving out like a certain amount of story points or percentage, however you're doing your sprint execution, to say like, okay, 15, 20, whatever percent of our bandwidth for this sprint is going to be spent on resolving tech debt. Now, that shouldn't be just an open free for all for the devs to decide what tech debt to work on. There should be a structured process around that that says, okay, let's put all the tech debt into tickets, into a backlog, and let's have a meeting to go through this and say, oh, this one's really killing us. This is most important. Let's prioritize that to the top. So
Yeah.
putting some structure around that, because I think, you know, again, these folks have good intentions, but there needs to be like a framework or a structure to help ensure that it's those intentions align with what the business needs.
Well, I'll give you another suggestion. So I think asking why is absolutely the right thing. And there's a second question.
Okay.
The second question I always ask, what if we don't do this? What if we don't? And I even deal with this with my wife on a regular basis. She's like, "We have to do this. We have to do this." And my response a lot of times is like, oh, we have to go to this thing, or we have to go buy this thing, or we have to do this. I'm like, what if we don't? Like, do I go to jail? Like, what happens?
Yeah.
And you know what our answer is usually? Nothing. It's like, so I don't have to do it, right? But that's the right question, though. When people ask about, hey, we could sell this customer if we do this thing, and you ask, well, what if we don't do it? Are they still going to sign up?
Right. That's that.
You want to do this technical debt thing. What if we don't do it? What's going to happen? It's like the whole system going to fall apart? Or like literally nothing's going to happen.
Right.
What if we don't do it? That's the other question I would always ask.
I think that's a really effective tool. Although, candidly, Matt, I don't know that I would use it on my wife personally. But,
this might be bad marital advice.
It would make for a great T-shirt, by the way. What if we don't?
What if we don't? Family vacation? What if we don't? Well, this has been a great conversation, and I love this top-down, bottoms-up. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing today and the type of customers that you're working with, and maybe
Sure.
helps me identify, like, Dave could really help me.
Yeah, thanks for that. So again, I have a fractional CPO consultancy. So, I'm helping early stage companies that you typically, they don't have the capital yet to hire a full-time product leader. In many cases, there's kind of what I call founder-led product, where you have a founding team that has some level of product savviness, enough to carry, the build from 0 to 1. But then they quickly get to a point where, like, okay, now we have something in the market. They have to refocus their time on,
They got a business to run.
They got a business to run. They got to raise some money. They got to keep investors happy. And so, but yet they still are not ready to commit to a full-time product leader. So I, strategically will parachute in and bridge the gap as a fractional product leader. And so, it's a really fun role where I get to collaborate with all these different entrepreneurs and different verticals, solving different problems, but they all need the framework and structure and discipline of product management. So, like I mentioned earlier, I'll come in, help them figure out the game plan, in some cases, help them build a team, help them get ready to execute, define the process for execution. A lot of times, like you were talking about, entrepreneurs don't really know how to build tech. So like, beyond just like what problem are we going to solve and how are we going to solve it? Like, what's the right process to get us there? So these are all typical types of, challenges that I help my clients with.
Very good.
And, like you mentioned earlier, my website is venturecpo.com. And my email is simply dave@venturecpo.com. Just a little plug there, Matt.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. And we'll see you guys on the next episode of Product Driven.
Thanks, Matt.